They mocked me when I was at my lowest, treating my divorce like a punchline at the family dinner table. My uncle's cruel laughter still echoes in my ears. My brother's smug remarks about my failures burned into my memory. What they never imagined was that behind my silence, I was sitting on $64 million and the power to own everything they once thought untouchable. Sometimes the quiet ones aren't broken. Sometimes we're just waiting for the perfect moment to strike back. My name is Rachel Monroe, and at 36, I thought I knew what rock bottom felt like. I was wrong. Cleveland in October has this way of stripping everything bare: the trees, the sky, and apparently, whatever dignity I had left. I sat in my Honda Civic outside my childhood home, staring at the warm yellow windows that used to mean safety. Now they felt like spotlights, ready to illuminate every failure I'd dragged back to this doorstep. The Monroe family house stood like a monument to middle-class respectability: 2 stories of white clapboard siding, black shutters that my mother Linda repainted every 3 years without fail, and a front porch where my father Richard still sat every evening at 6:30 sharp, reading the Cleveland Plain Dealer like the world's problems could be solved with local news and a beer. But respectability, I'd learned, was just another word for keeping up appearances while everything rotted underneath. Inside, I could see the familiar scene playing out. Dad would be in his leather recliner, the one that molded perfectly to his 58-year-old frame after 20 years of holding court. Mom would be bustling between the kitchen and dining room, setting the table with the same floral china we'd used for every family gathering since I was 12, and my older brother Golden Boy Brian would be holding court near the fireplace, probably detailing his latest triumph at Monroe Industries, the family manufacturing company that had been our bread and butter for 3 generations. The company that was supposed to be my legacy, too, until they made it clear that daughters don't inherit industrial empires. That's what sons are for. Brian was 38, 2 years older than me, and had spent his entire adult life being groomed to take over from Dad. Where I was all sharp angles and restless energy, Brian was solid, dependable, the kind of man who wore khakis on weekends and called it casual. He'd married his college sweetheart Sarah at 25, bought a house 4 streets over from our parents, and produced 2 perfect children who called our father Papa and knew exactly which fork to use for salad. I, on the other hand, had just signed divorce papers 3 weeks ago. The marriage had been dying for 2 years, but admitting it felt like confessing to a crime I wasn't sure I'd committed. Michael and I had simply faded, like watercolors left in the sun too long. He wanted children immediately, a house in the suburbs, and a wife who baked cookies for PTA meetings. I wanted to build something, create something, leave a mark that mattered. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was sitting outside the very suburban house I'd sworn I'd never replicate, about to face the family who'd spent my entire life telling me what I should want instead of asking what I actually did want. Through the window, I caught sight of Uncle Gary's unmistakable silhouette. He was Dad's younger brother, 54 years old and proud of never letting anyone forget that he'd been the star quarterback in high school. Gary had this way of filling up a room with his voice, his opinions, and his absolute certainty that everyone else was doing life wrong. He'd been divorced twice himself, but that somehow qualified him to offer marriage advice to anyone within earshot. Mom appeared in the window, probably checking to see if I'd finally worked up the courage to come inside. Linda Monroe was the kind of woman who believed that most problems could be solved with a hot meal and enough prayer, though she'd never met a conflict she couldn't sidestep entirely. She meant well, I knew that, but her idea of support usually involved suggesting that maybe if I tried harder, smiled more, or dressed differently, things would just naturally work themselves out. The truth was, our family looked perfect from the outside. We had Sunday dinners, sent Christmas cards with professionally taken photos, and never missed church on Easter. But underneath all that Norman Rockwell polish was a rigid hierarchy that hadn't evolved since 1950. Men worked, women supported, and anyone who colored outside those lines was gently but firmly guided back into their proper place. I'd been trying to find my proper place for 36 years, and all I'd managed to do was disappoint everyone, including myself. My phone buzzed with a text from Mom. "Dinner's ready, honey. We're waiting for you." Waiting for me. The failed daughter, the divorced woman, the family project who couldn't even keep a husband happy. I could already hear Uncle Gary's voice, booming across the dinner table about how women these days don't know what they want, and how, back in his day, people worked harder to make things last. I turned off the engine and grabbed my purse, steeling myself for another evening of well-meaning concern and thinly veiled disappointment. They loved me. I knew they did, but they loved the version of me they thought I should be even more. If only they knew what I was really capable of. The moment I walked through that front door, I knew I'd made a mistake. The dining room was packed with the usual suspects' aunts, uncles, and cousins who materialized whenever Mom announced a family dinner. The air was thick with the smell of pot roast and barely concealed anticipation. Everyone had heard about the divorce. Of course, in a family like ours, bad news traveled faster than gossip at a church potluck. "There she is!" Uncle Gary's voice boomed across the room before I'd even hung up my coat. The newly liberated woman herself. The conversation died. 23 pairs of eyes turned toward me like I was a car accident they couldn't look away from. I forced a smile and made my way to the empty chair they'd saved for me right between Gary and my cousin Jennifer, who'd been married to the same man since she was 19 and never let anyone forget it. "Rachel, honey, you look thin," Mom said, already piling food onto my plate like calories could somehow fix a broken marriage. "Are you eating enough? I worry about women living alone. They forget to take care of themselves." "I'm fine, Mom." I cut a piece of pot roast, trying to ignore the weight of everyone's stare. "Fine." Gary leaned back in his chair, his beer gut straining against his polo shirt. "Is that what we're calling it? Because from where I'm sitting, losing a husband seems like the opposite of fine." A few uncomfortable chuckles rippled around the table. Dad cleared his throat, his universal signal for Gary to tone it down, but Gary was just getting started. "I mean, let's be honest here," he continued, gesturing with his fork. "Marriage is the biggest responsibility a woman has. It's literally your one job. Keep your man happy, keep your home together, and for God's sake, give the poor guy some kids before his biological clock runs out too." "Gary," Mom said softly, but he barreled on. "What I'm saying is, if you can't handle something as basic as marriage, how are you supposed to handle anything else in life? Real responsibilities. I mean..." My hands clenched around my napkin. "Maybe some marriages aren't worth saving." "See, that's exactly the problem." Gary slapped the table, making the water glasses jump. "Women today think they can just walk away when things get tough. Back in my day..." "You mean back when you got divorced twice?" The words slipped out before I could stop them. The table went dead silent. Gary's face turned the color of Mom's beets, but he recovered quickly. "That's different. Sweetheart, I was young, didn't know what I wanted, but you're 36 years old. Rachel, this was supposed to be your prime time, your chance to build something lasting. Instead, you threw it all away because what he didn't make enough money didn't worship the ground you walked on." "That's enough," Dad said, but his voice lacked conviction. Brian, who'd been suspiciously quiet up until now, finally spoke up. "Look, Rachel, we all want what's best for you, but Uncle Gary has a point. This divorce, it doesn't exactly inspire confidence." I looked at my brother, really looked at him, his perfectly pressed button-down shirt, his wedding ring that he still twisted when he was nervous, the way he avoided my eyes when he spoke. "Confidence in what?" "In your judgment, your ability to see things through." Brian took a sip of wine, choosing his words carefully. "I mean, if you can't manage your personal life, how could anyone trust you with something bigger? Something that actually matters?" The words hit like a physical blow. Something that actually matters. "You know what I mean. Business. Real responsibility. The company." And there it was. The thing we never talked about directly, but that hung over every family gathering like incense. Monroe Industries. The family legacy that had somehow skipped over me entirely and landed squarely on Brian's shoulders. "Brian," Mom warned, but he was on a roll now. "I'm just saying, running a company requires stability, commitment. You have to be able to stick with something even when it gets hard, even when it's not perfect." He gestured toward me with his fork. "This whole divorce thing, it's just proof that you give up when things don't go your way." Uncle Gary nodded enthusiastically. "Exactly. You can't just abandon ship every time the water gets choppy. That's not how successful people think." "And what would you know about successful people?" I asked quietly. Gary laughed, actually laughed. "More than you, apparently. I may not have a fancy college degree, but I know that quitters don't win, and winners don't quit their marriages because they're not fulfilled, or whatever feminist nonsense you've been reading." The room was spinning now, or maybe that was just the rage making me dizzy. I looked around the table at all these faces, people who were supposed to love me, support me, be my family, and all I saw was judgment, disappointment, pity. "You want to know what I think?" Gary leaned forward, his voice dropping to what he probably thought was a compassionate tone. "I think you're scared. Scared of real commitment, real responsibility. It's easier to run away and play victim than to do the hard work of being an adult." I stood up so fast my chair scraped against the hardwood floor. "I need some air." "Rachel." Mom started, but I was already moving toward the door. "That's right. Walk away," Gary called after me. "Just like you walked away from your marriage. It's what you do best." I stopped in the doorway, my hand on the frame, and turned back to face them. 23 pairs of eyes, all watching me with varying degrees of disappointment and superiority. "You're right," I said quietly. "I am good at walking away. From situations that don't serve me. From people who don't respect me. From places where I'm not valued." "Honey," Mom said, "we just want—" "You want me to be smaller, quieter, more grateful for whatever scraps of approval you're willing to throw my way." I looked directly at Gary, then at Brian. "Well, congratulations. You got exactly what you wanted, the failure of the family, right here in living color." I walked out then, leaving behind the pot roast and the judgment and the crushing weight of their expectations. But Gary's voice followed me all the way to my car. "So that's the biggest failure of a woman's life right there. Can't even take a little honest feedback." I sat in my Honda Civic in the driveway, hands shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. Through the dining room window, I could see them all settling back into their chairs, probably already dissecting my dramatic exit, reinforcing their certainty that I was exactly the mess they'd always suspected I was. They had no idea what they'd just done. They had no idea what I was capable of, driving home through the dark Cleveland streets. Gary's words echoed in my head like a broken record. "Can't handle real responsibility. Biggest failure of a woman's life." If only he knew the irony of what he'd just said. Because 10 years ago, when I first told my family I was starting a tech company, Gary had said almost exactly the same thing. I was 26 then, fresh out of my MBA program at Case Western, and burning with an idea that kept me awake at night. Digital payments were still clunky, still required multiple steps and fees that ate into small businesses' already thin margins. I saw an opportunity to streamline everything to create a platform that could handle transactions, inventory tracking, and customer data all in one place. To technology, Dad had said when I pitched the idea at Sunday dinner. "Honey, that's not a real business. That's just playing with computers." "It's the future. Dad, small businesses are drowning in paperwork and transaction fees. What I'm building could save them thousands of dollars a year." Uncle Gary had actually snorted. "You want to know what saves businesses money? Good old-fashioned hard work. Not some fancy computer program that'll be obsolete in 6 months." "She's always been a dreamer," Mom had added, like it was a character flaw. "Remember when she wanted to be an astronaut and then a marine biologist? This is just another phase." but Brian had been the worst. Look, Rachel, I admire your creativity, but let's be realistic here. You don't know anything about running a business. You've never even managed people. Maybe start smaller. Get some experience at a real company first. A real company, like the one he was being handed on a silver platter. I have a business plan, I'd insisted. Revenue projections, market analysis, everything. I just need— You need to stop chasing fantasies. Gary had interrupted. Technology doesn't feed families. It doesn't build communities. It doesn't create real jobs for real people like manufacturing does. Dad had nodded along. Your grandfather built Monroe Industries with his bare hands. He understood that real wealth comes from making things people actually need, not whatever this is. I'd left that dinner feeling like I'd been physically beaten, but instead of giving up, I'd gotten angry. Angry enough to work 16-hour days in a cramped office above a coffee shop in Cleveland Heights. Angry enough to max out 3 credit cards and eat ramen noodles for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Angry enough to prove them all wrong. Payflow. That's what I called my company. Started with just me and a computer I'd built myself from spare parts. The first version of the software was crude, buggy, and crashed more often than it worked. But it worked often enough to attract my first client, a small bakery in Little Italy, whose owner was tired of losing 3% of every sale to credit card fees. Then came the coffee shop next door, then the vintage clothing boutique across the street. Word spread through Cleveland's small business community like wildfire. Here was a local solution, built by someone who understood their problems, priced for people who counted every penny. I reinvested every dollar back into the company, hired my first employee, a brilliant programmer named Jake who believed in the vision enough to work for equity instead of salary. Then came Maria, who handled customer service with the kind of warmth that made our clients feel like family. By year 3, we had 12 employees and were processing over $10 million in transactions annually. Meanwhile, my actual family continued to treat Payflow like an expensive hobby. Still playing with computers, Gary would ask at family gatherings, like I was a child who hadn't outgrown video games. "Oh, how's your little startup going?" Brian would inquire with that condescending smile, usually right before launching into a detailed explanation of Monroe Industries' latest contract with some manufacturing giant. Dad would pat my shoulder and say things like, "Well, as long as you're keeping busy," as if Payflow was some kind of elaborate craft project designed to fill my empty hours. They couldn't see what I was building because they couldn't imagine that their woman, could build something bigger than their understanding. To them, technology was mysterious, unreliable, somehow less real than the metal parts and industrial machinery they knew how to value. But by year 5, Payflow was processing transactions for over 3,000 small businesses across the Midwest. We'd expanded into inventory management, customer analytics, and automated bookkeeping. The little coffee shop software had become a comprehensive business platform that was saving our clients millions of dollars collectively. And still, my family saw it as a cute distraction from my real job finding a husband and producing grandchildren. When are you going to settle down?" Mom would ask every holiday. "You can't run around playing entrepreneur forever. Your biological clock is ticking. Maybe if you focused less on work and more on your personal life, you'd find someone," Jennifer would add helpfully. The irony was suffocating. While they worried about my biological clock, I was building something that would outlast all of us. While they questioned my priorities, major corporations were starting to notice what we'd created in Cleveland. The first acquisition offer came when I was 32. A mid-sized financial services company wanted to buy Payflow for $12 million. I turned them down, not because the money wasn't life-changing, but because I knew we were worth more. Much more. The second offer came 18 months later. $28 million. I turned that down too. The third offer, from Global Tech Solutions, arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, just 3 weeks before my divorce became final. $64 million, all cash, for the little computer company that my family had spent a decade dismissing. I accepted immediately. The whole transaction was handled through lawyers and financial advisors with non-disclosure agreements thick as phone books. No press releases, no public announcements, just a wire transfer that appeared in my account at 2:15 p.m. on a Thursday, turning me into a multimillionaire while I sat in a Starbucks wearing jeans and a 5-year-old sweater. I never told my family. Not about the sale, not about the money, not about the fact that their failed daughter had just achieved more financial success than Monroe Industries had seen in its entire 3-generation history. Instead, I quietly moved into a modest apartment, drove the same Honda Civic I'd owned for 8 years, and let them continue believing I was their charity case, their disappointment, their cautionary tale about what happens when women try to reach beyond their proper place. Sitting in my driveway now, still shaking from tonight's humiliation, I thought about that wire transfer, about the $64 million sitting in investment accounts, growing steadily while my family continued to treat me like their greatest failure. Can't handle real responsibility. Gary had said, if only he knew that I was about to handle more responsibility than he could imagine. If only he knew that his precious Monroe Industries was about to become mine. The opportunity came disguised as casual conversation at a coffee shop 3 weeks later. I was sitting in my usual spot at Arabica, laptop open, pretending to job hunt while actually researching investment opportunities. The divorce had given me the perfect cover story everyone expected a newly single woman to be scrambling for employment, desperate to rebuild her life from scratch. That's when I overheard 2 men at the table behind me discussing Monroe Industries. The whole sector's been hit hard, one of them was saying. His voice carried the practiced authority of someone used to being listened to. Manufacturing's been bleeding for months. Supply chain disruptions, labor shortages, increased material costs. A lot of these family operations are hanging on by a thread. What about Monroe Industries specifically? His companion asked. They've been around forever. Solid reputation. Reputation doesn't pay the bills when you're leveraged to the hilt. I nearly choked on my latte. Leveraged to the hilt, Dad had always preached about the importance of conservative financial management, about never borrowing more than you could afford to lose. It was one of his fundamental business principles, something he'd drilled into Brian from childhood. How bad is it? The second voice asked. Bad enough that they're quietly shopping for investors. Word is they took out a massive loan 18 months ago to retool their main production line. Some kind of automation upgrade that was supposed to revolutionize their efficiency. My fingers froze over my keyboard. 18 months ago. That would have been right around the time Brian started bragging about modernizing the family business and bringing Monroe Industries into the 21st century. Let me guess. The first man continued. The automation didn't deliver the promised returns. Worse than that, the new equipment has been plagued with problems, constant breakdowns, compatibility issues with their existing systems. They're spending more on maintenance and troubleshooting than they're saving on labor costs. I risked a glance over my shoulder. The men were in their 50s, wearing expensive suits and carrying the kind of leather portfolios that screamed private equity or investment banking, not the type of people who gossiped idly about struggling manufacturers. So they're looking for a white knight. They're looking for anyone with deep enough pockets to keep the lights on. Problem is, their business model is fundamentally outdated. Industrial components manufacturing is a race to the bottom now. Everything's moving overseas or being automated by companies with 10 times their capital reserves. The second man shook his head. Family businesses are always the last to adapt. Too much emotional attachment to the way things have always been done. Exactly. Richard Monroe's a decent guy, and his son seems competent enough. But they're fighting yesterday's war. The market has moved on without them. I turned back to my laptop, but my mind was racing. Monroe Industries, the company that was supposedly too important and complex for a woman to understand, was failing, not just struggling, but actively hemorrhaging money while Dad and Brian pretended everything was under control. That evening, I drove past the Monroe Industries facility for the first time in years. The building looked exactly the same from the outside 2 stories of red brick and steel, with the company logo Dad had commissioned in 1985 still hanging proudly above the main entrance. But now I noticed things I'd overlooked before the employee parking lot was half empty at 5:30 p. Prime time for a manufacturing operation. Several of the loading dock doors were closed, suggesting reduced production capacity. And there, in the corner of the lot where Dad used to park his pride and joy, a pristine 1995 Buick, sat a much newer Toyota, a car that screamed, "We're cutting costs everywhere we can." Over the next 2 weeks, I conducted my own quiet investigation. Public records revealed that Monroe Industries had indeed taken out a substantial loan, $4.2 million secured against the company's real estate and equipment. The loan terms suggested they'd been desperate enough to accept an interest rate that would make a credit card company blush. I pulled their supplier payment records through a contact I'd maintained from my payflow days. Monroe Industries was running 60 to 90 days behind on most payments, a classic sign of cash flow problems. Several longtime suppliers had moved them to cash-on-delivery terms only. But the most damning evidence came from their own website. The current job openings page had been empty for over 6 months. For a manufacturing company, that meant they weren't growing, they were contracting, probably through attrition rather than layoffs, to avoid the negative publicity that comes with firing longtime employees. I also discovered something that made my stomach twist with a mixture of rage and dark satisfaction. Brian had been quietly shopping the company to potential buyers for the past 4 months. Not investors' buyers. He was looking to sell Monroe Industries entirely, to walk away from the family legacy with whatever he could salvage. The same family legacy he'd told me I couldn't be trusted with because I'd gotten divorced. The final piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source, my divorce attorney's office. While reviewing some final paperwork, I mentioned Monroe Industries in passing, and my attorney's assistant perked up immediately. "Oh, we're handling their bankruptcy consultation," she said, then immediately looked mortified. "I probably shouldn't have said that. Bankruptcy consultation. Just preliminary." She backpedaled quickly. "Chapter 11, reorganization options. Lots of companies explore that route when they're restructuring. Chapter 11, reorganization. The kind of legal protection companies seek when they can no longer pay their debts and need court supervision to stay afloat. My family's precious Monroe Industries, the company that was supposedly too important for a mere woman to understand, was so far underwater that they were consulting bankruptcy attorneys. And through it all, they continued to treat me like their greatest disappointment, the family failure who couldn't even keep a husband, let alone handle real responsibility. That night, I sat in my apartment with a bottle of wine and my laptop, staring at Monroe Industries' financial death spiral spreadsheet on my screen. The numbers told a story of pride, poor decisions, and the kind of stubborn refusal to adapt that kills family businesses every day. But they also told another story opportunity. Because Monroe Industries might be failing under current management, but the company still had assets, real estate, equipment, an established customer base, and decades of industry relationships. In the right hands that understood both traditional manufacturing and modern technology, it could be salvaged. More importantly, it could be acquired. I opened a new browser tab and began researching acquisition lawyers, investment shell companies, and the kind of financial structures that would allow someone to buy a failing family business without the family knowing who their new owner really was. Because I was done being underestimated. I was done being dismissed. And I was definitely done watching my family's arrogance blind them to the poetic justice that was about to unfold. Monroe Industries was about to be saved by the one person they'd spent 36 years telling couldn't handle real responsibility. Me. I should have known they wouldn't let me retreat quietly into obscurity. 2 months after that disastrous family dinner, Mom called with her voice bright with forced cheer. "Rachel, honey, we're having everyone over for Thanksgiving. The whole family will be there. Aunt Susan's flying in from Phoenix, and you know how she loves to see you." What she really meant was, we're having another opportunity for everyone to dissect your life choices over turkey and stuffing. "I don't know, Mom. I'm still adjusting." Nonsense. Family is exactly what you need right now. Besides, Brian has some exciting news to share about the company. Good news. For once. Good news. I almost laughed out loud. Based on my research, Monroe Industries was circling the drain faster than ever. Their last quarterly payment to the bank had been 2 weeks late, and they'd just lost their second biggest client to a competitor who could actually deliver on schedule. But curiosity won out over self-preservation. I needed to see this performance for myself. Thanksgiving Day arrived gray and cold, with the kind of Cleveland weather that makes you question every life choice that's kept you in Ohio. I pulled into my parents' driveway at exactly 3 o'clock, fashionably late enough to avoid having to help with preparation, but early enough to avoid the passive-aggressive comments about punctuality. The house was already full of voices, laughter, and the competing aromas of Mom's traditional feast. I found the usual suspects gathered in the living room, Dad in his recliner, Uncle Gary holding court near the fireplace, and Brian standing by the window with a drink in his hand, looking every inch the successful businessman in his perfectly pressed khakis and navy blazer. "So there's our career woman," Uncle Gary boomed the moment he spotted me. "How's the job hunt going? Find anyone desperate enough to hire a woman with your unique qualifications?" The room chuckled. I forced a smile and accepted a glass of wine from Mom, who was already studying my face with that worried mother expression that meant she'd been rehearsing helpful suggestions all week. "Actually," I said, settling into the love seat next to Aunt Susan, "I'm taking some time to explore my options. Maybe start something new." Start something new. Brian laughed, but there was an edge to it. "Rachel, you're 36 years old. This isn't the time for career experiments. You need stability, benefits, a steady paycheck." "Maybe she could work for you," Aunt Susan suggested innocently. "Doesn't Monroe Industries need office help? Someone to answer phones or file paperwork?" The condescension was so thick I could have cut it with Mom's carving knife. Office help, filing paperwork. The woman who'd built and sold a $64 million company reduced to answering phones for her baby brother. "Actually," Dad said, clearing his throat in that way that meant he was about to make an important announcement, "that might not be an option much longer." Brian shot him a warning look, but Dad continued, "We've been having some challenges at the company. Nothing we can't handle, but it's been a difficult few years." "Challenges?" I asked, playing dumb. "The economy," Brian said quickly. "Supply chain issues, labor costs, all the usual headaches of running a manufacturing business." Uncle Gary nodded sagely. "That's the problem with real business. Real responsibility. Not like these tech companies that exist only on paper. When you're making actual products, employing actual people, you face actual problems." I took a sip of wine and waited. "But we're turning it around," Brian continued, his voice gaining confidence. "In fact, we're in talks with some serious investors, real players who understand the value of what we've built." "Investors?" Aunt Susan asked. "Private equity, mostly. Groups that specialize in taking established companies to the next level." Brian was warming to his theme now, pacing slightly as he spoke. "They see the potential in Monroe Industries, the brand recognition, the customer relationships, the manufacturing expertise." Dad looked less convinced. "It's a big decision, bringing in outside partners." "It's the smart decision," Brian countered. "These people have resources we could never access on our own. Capital for expansion, connections to new markets, operational expertise from running companies 10 times our size." I set down my wine glass. "What kind of operational expertise?" Brian paused, probably surprised that I'd asked a business question instead of inquiring about the cranberry sauce recipe. "Efficiency optimization, cost structure analysis, market positioning strategies." He was using the kind of corporate buzzwords that meant he'd been talking to consultants, the kind of high-level thinking that comes from managing truly large-scale operations. "And these investors," I continued, "they want to buy the company outright." "Not buy," Brian said quickly. "Partner. We'd retain operational control while they provide the financial backing and strategic guidance. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Because what he was describing wasn't partnership, it was acquisition with a polite fiction wrapped around it. Private equity groups didn't invest in struggling family manufacturers out of the goodness of their hearts. They bought distressed assets, stripped out anything valuable, and sold the pieces to the highest bidder. That sounds complicated, I said. It's the reality of modern business, Brian replied. You can't just rely on the old ways anymore. You have to adapt or die. The irony was staggering. My brother, who'd spent years lecturing me about the importance of tradition and proven methods, was about to hand over our family's company to vulture capitalists because he couldn't figure out how to run it profitably. What do you think, Rachel? Uncle Gary asked with that smirk that meant he was setting up another punchline. Any advice for your brother? Maybe some of that entrepreneurial wisdom you picked up playing with computers. The room went quiet, everyone waiting for my response. I could feel their expectations, their certainty that I'd say something naive or idealistic that would prove, once again, that I didn't understand how real business worked. I think, I said slowly, that family businesses face unique challenges in today's market. Legacy operations especially struggle with the transition from traditional models to modern efficiency standards. Brian blinked, probably surprised by the business-like response. But private equity partnerships can be tricky. I continued. The operational changes they typically implement often conflict with the cultural values that made family businesses successful in the first place. Cultural values don't pay the bills, Gary said. No, but they do retain customers and employees and institutional knowledge. I was getting warmed up now, letting just enough of my actual expertise show to make them uncomfortable. The most successful transitions I've seen preserve core operational identity while integrating modern systems gradually. The room was staring at me like I'd started speaking Mandarin. Well, where exactly did you pick up all this business theory? Brian asked, his tone caught between skepticism and grudging interest. I smiled. You'd be surprised what you learn when you actually run a company instead of inheriting one. The silence that followed was delicious. Brian's face went through several shades of red before he managed to speak. Well, he said stiffly, theory is one thing, practice is another, and the practice is that Monroe Industries needs serious capital investment to survive. How serious? I asked. Serious enough that we can't afford to wait for perfect solutions, Dad interjected. Sometimes you have to make hard choices. Hard choices, like selling the family legacy to strangers because you were too proud to admit you'd made catastrophic management decisions. I'm sure you'll figure it out, I said, raising my wine glass in a mock toast. After all, you're the ones with real business experience. Uncle Gary laughed, missing the sarcasm entirely. That's right. Leave the big decisions to people who actually know what they're doing. If only he knew that the biggest decision of their lives was about to be made for them. By someone they'd spent decades insisting didn't know what she was doing, the plan began forming during my drive home from that Thanksgiving disaster, crystallizing with every mile of Cleveland asphalt beneath my wheels. By the time I reached my apartment, I knew exactly what I was going to do. The next morning, I called Margaret Harrison, the attorney who'd handled my Payflow sale. Margaret was the kind of woman who wore power suits like armor and had never met a complex financial transaction she couldn't structure to her client's advantage. Rachel, she said when her assistant put me through, how's retirement treating you? I'm thinking of coming out of retirement, quietly. There was a pause. Margaret had helped enough tech entrepreneurs navigate acquisitions to recognize the tone in my voice. What kind of quietly are we talking about? The kind that involves shell companies, anonymous investment vehicles, and a distressed manufacturing business in Cleveland. I could practically hear her smile through the phone. The fun kind of quietly. How distressed. Distressed enough that they're shopping for white knight investors. Not distressed enough to know they should be more careful about who they're talking to. 2 weeks later, I was sitting in Margaret's downtown office, surrounded by incorporation documents, financial projections, and a corporate structure so elegantly complex it could have been taught in business school. Midwest Industrial Partners, LLC, Margaret explained, sliding the papers across her mahogany desk. Incorporated in Delaware, managed through a Nevada trust, with operational headquarters in Chicago. On paper, you're a private investment group specializing in manufacturing sector turnarounds. And in reality, you're a private investment group specializing in manufacturing sector turnarounds. It's just that the group consists of one very wealthy, very motivated woman with a very specific target in mind. The beauty of the structure was its simplicity. Midwest Industrial Partners would approach Monroe Industries as exactly what they claimed to be serious investors with the capital and expertise to salvage a struggling family business. Every document, every credential, every reference would check out because they were all completely legitimate. What about due diligence? I asked. They're going to want to verify our track record. Margaret smiled. That's the beautiful part. Midwest Industrial Partners has a track record. We've structured it as a subsidiary of Hartwell Capital Management, which has been quietly acquiring and restructuring small manufacturing companies for the past 18 months. Hartwell Capital Management, a fund we established using a portion of your pay flow proceeds, completely above board, completely profitable, and completely anonymous. As far as anyone knows, Midwest Industrial Partners is just their latest venture into the Ohio market. I had to admire the elegance of it. I wasn't just creating a fictional company to buy Monroe Industries. I was creating a real company with real assets and a real track record of success. By the time Dad and Brian finished their due diligence, they'd be begging me to take their money. The next phase required patience. Midwest Industrial Partners couldn't appear too eager or too perfectly informed about Monroe Industries' situation. We needed to approach them as one of several investment opportunities we were considering, not as a targeted acquisition. I spent January and February building the facade. Midwest Industrial Partners opened offices in a prestigious Chicago high-rise, hired a small staff of actual investment professionals, and began making inquiries about distressed manufacturing assets throughout the Midwest. We even completed 2 legitimate acquisitions, a metal fabrication shop in Indiana and a packaging company in Michigan, to establish our credentials. By March, Monroe Industries was exactly where I expected them to be: desperate. Their bank had issued a formal notice of default on their loan. 2 more major clients had jumped ship, and Brian's serious investors had proven to be bottom feeders offering pennies on the dollar for assets that had taken 3 generations to build. That's when Margaret made the call. Mr. Monroe, this is Margaret Harrison from Midwest Industrial Partners. We're a private investment group specializing in manufacturing sector opportunities, and your company has come to our attention. I listened from Margaret's office as she delivered the pitch perfectly. Midwest Industrial Partners had been tracking Monroe Industries for several months, impressed by their reputation and customer relationships. We were looking for a strategic partnership that would preserve the family legacy while providing the capital injection needed for modernization and growth. We're not vulture capitalists, Mr. Monroe, Margaret said smoothly. We're industry specialists who understand that the best investments are the ones where everyone wins. Your family retains operational control, your employees keep their jobs, and your customers continue receiving the quality products they've come to expect. Brian took the bait immediately. Within 48 hours, he'd sent over their complete financial statements, customer lists, and a business plan that read like a desperate plea for salvation. The numbers were even worse than I'd imagined. Monroe Industries was bleeding cash at a rate that would force bankruptcy within 6 months. They owed money to everyone's suppliers, contractors, the bank, even the company that serviced their coffee machines. But underneath the financial carnage, I could see what I'd suspected all along: the bones of a good business: solid customer relationships, quality manufacturing equipment, and a brand reputation that had taken decades to build. All of it being destroyed by poor management and a stubborn refusal to adapt to changing markets. All of it about to become mine. The due diligence process took 6 weeks, Margaret's team descended on Monroe Industries like a swarm of perfectly dressed locusts, examining every contract, every piece of equipment, every line item in their books. Dad and Brian treated them like visiting royalty, desperate to make a good impression on the investors who could save their company. I stayed away from Cleveland entirely during this period, letting Margaret handle all the interactions while I monitored the process from Chicago. Every few days, she'd update me on the family's growing desperation, their willingness to accept increasingly favorable terms, their pathetic gratitude for being considered worthy of investment. "Your brother actually thanked me yesterday," Margaret told me during one of our weekly calls. "Said Midwest Industrial Partners was the answer to their prayers." "Did he really?" His exact words were, "You people understand what we've built here. You appreciate the value of tradition and family legacy." I almost felt bad for him. Almost, but not quite bad enough to stop. The final negotiation took place on a Thursday afternoon in April. Margaret called to inform me that Monroe Industries had accepted our terms. Midwest Industrial Partners would acquire 75% ownership of the company for $8.5 million, enough to pay off their debts and provide working capital for operations. The family would retain 25% ownership and operational control, with Brian continuing as president and Dad remaining as chairman of the board. In exchange, Midwest Industrial Partners would have the right to approve all major business decisions and could assume full operational control if performance targets weren't met. It was, Margaret noted with professional satisfaction, exactly the kind of deal that sounded generous but gave us complete power over the company's future. "When do we close?" I asked. "Next Friday, 2:00 at their attorney's office. The whole family will be there to sign the papers and celebrate their salvation." I hung up the phone and stared out my apartment window at the Cleveland skyline. Somewhere out there, Dad and Brian were probably toasting their good fortune, congratulating themselves on finding investors sophisticated enough to appreciate what they'd built. They had no idea they were about to hand their company over to the family failure they'd spent 36 years dismissing. But they were about to find out. The closing was scheduled for 2:00 on a Friday afternoon at Brennan & Associates, the same law firm that had handled Monroe Industries' legal affairs for the past 20 years. I arrived at 1:55, walking through the marble lobby in a black Armani suit I'd bought specifically for this moment. The receptionist directed me to Conference Room A, where I could hear familiar voices through the heavy oak doors. Dad's measured tone discussing quarterly projections. Brian's confident laugh as he explained something about manufacturing efficiency. Uncle Gary's booming voice making jokes about finally working with people who understand real business. I paused outside those doors, my hand on the brass handle, and allowed myself one moment to savor what was about to happen. Then I walked in. The conference room fell silent like someone had hit a mute button. 8 pairs of eyes turned toward me. Dad, Mom, Brian, Uncle Gary, and 4 other family members who'd been invited to witness the family company's salvation. At the head of the table sat Montgomery Brennan himself, the silver-haired attorney who'd been handling Monroe family business since before I was born. "I'm sorry," Brian said, half rising from his chair. "I think you have the wrong room. We're in the middle of a private business meeting." I set my briefcase on the table and took the empty seat directly across from him. "Actually, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Dad frowned. "Rachel, what are you doing here? This is a closing meeting for the acquisition of Monroe Industries by Midwest Industrial Partners," I finished, "which is why I'm here." The confusion on their faces was almost comical. Uncle Gary was the first to put the pieces together, his expression shifting from bewilderment to something approaching panic. "What the hell are you talking about?" he demanded. I opened my briefcase and removed the acquisition documents, placing them neatly on the table. "I'm talking about the fact that Midwest Industrial Partners is my company. Has been from the beginning." The silence stretched so long I could hear the traffic humming on the street below. Dad's face had gone pale. Brian looked like he'd been punched in the stomach. Mom just stared at me with her mouth slightly open. "That's impossible," Brian whispered. "Is it?" I gestured toward Montgomery Brennan, who was studying the documents with the careful attention of a man who suddenly realized he'd been representing both sides of a transaction without knowing it. "Mr. Brennan, would you care to verify the signature authorization for Midwest Industrial Partners?" Brennan cleared his throat. "The documents are legitimate. Ms. Monroe appears to have full authority to execute this transaction on behalf of the acquiring entity." "Ms. Monroe," Uncle Gary repeated, his voice rising. "You're telling me that this whole thing, the investors, the meetings, the due diligence, all of it was her—" "All of it," I confirmed. Brian finally found his voice. "Where the hell did you get $8.5 million? "From selling my company. The technology company you spent 10 years telling me was just playing with computers." The room erupted. Uncle Gary started shouting about fraud and deception. Brian demanded to know how this was legal. Dad just sat there shaking his head like he couldn't process what he was hearing. I let them vent for a moment, then stood up. "Gentlemen," I said quietly, and something in my tone cut through the chaos. "You have a choice to make. You can sign these documents and receive $8.5 million to pay off your debts and stabilize your operations, or you can walk away and declare bankruptcy within 6 months." "This is blackmail," Brian said. "No, this is business. The same business you've been conducting for the past 6 weeks, thinking you were dealing with sophisticated investors from Chicago instead of your disappointing sister from Cleveland." I walked around the table slowly, like a prosecutor delivering a closing argument. For 36 years, you've told me I don't understand real responsibility, that I can't handle important decisions, that women like me should focus on supporting men like you instead of trying to build something meaningful. Dad tried to interrupt, but I held up my hand. Do you want to know what real responsibility looks like? It looks like turning a failing company into a $64 million success story while everyone around you insists you're wasting your time. It looks like sitting quietly while your family treats your achievements like cute hobbies, then using those achievements to save the company they've driven into the ground. Uncle Gary's face was purple now. "You little—" "I'm not little anymore. Gary, I'm the majority owner of Monroe Industries, which means every cruel joke you've made at my expense, every time you've dismissed my opinions, every moment you've treated me like the family charity case, all of that stops today." I turned to Brian, who was gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles had gone white. "You wanted to know about real business experience. I just outmaneuvered you for 6 months without you even realizing you were being played. I bought your company with money I earned, building something you insisted was impossible. And I did it all while you were telling our relatives that I couldn't be trusted with real responsibility." "Rachel," Mom said softly, "why didn't you tell us about the money, about your success?" I looked at her, really looked at her, and for a moment, my anger softened. "Because you wouldn't have believed me, Mom. Just like you didn't believe in Payflow when I was building it. Just like you've never believed I was capable of anything more significant than finding a husband and producing grandchildren. The truth of that statement hung in the air like smoke. No one could deny it because we all knew it was accurate." Montgomery Brennan cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should proceed with the signing. The documents have been reviewed and approved by all parties." "No," Brian said, standing up abruptly. "I won't sign this. I don't care if she is family. I won't hand over my company to someone who deceived us." I smiled. "Your company, Brian. You mortgaged this company into bankruptcy. You made management decisions that destroyed 3 generations of family legacy. The only reason Monroe Industries still exists is because I'm willing to save it. Save it or destroy it out of spite? I guess you'll find out when you sign those papers." Dad finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "What happens if we sign? You get to keep your jobs, keep your dignity, and keep 25% ownership of a company that might actually turn a profit under proper management. You also get to watch me prove that everything you've believed about my capabilities has been wrong from the beginning. And if we don't sign—" I closed my briefcase with a decisive snap. "Then you declare bankruptcy, lose everything anyway, and spend the rest of your lives knowing that the family failure you never believed in was the only person willing to save what you couldn't protect yourselves. I looked around the room one final time, meeting each pair of eyes with the calm confidence of someone who held all the cards. The choice is yours, but choose quickly. I have other companies to buy. The silence stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap. I could hear Uncle Gary's labored breathing, see the vein pulsing in Brian's temple, watch Dad's hands tremble as they rested on the polished conference table. For 36 years, I had been the one sitting in uncomfortable silence while they made decisions about my life, my worth, my place in their carefully ordered world. Now they were the ones squirming, the ones without options, the ones discovering what powerlessness actually felt like. "This is insane!" Uncle Gary finally erupted, his voice cracking with desperation. You can't do this to family." I turned to him slowly, savoring every second of his discomfort. "I do what? Exactly. Save a failing company. Provide the capital injection you've been begging for. Offer you employment when any other investor would have cleaned house completely." "You know what I mean," he sputtered. "This whole elaborate scheme, this deception." "Shh, you mean conducting business?" I interrupted, because that's all this was. Gary. Business. The same kind of business you've spent decades telling me I was too emotional, too unstable, too fundamentally female to understand. Brian was staring at the documents like they might spontaneously combust. "How long?" he asked quietly. "How long have you been planning this?" "I started planning this the night you told me I couldn't handle real responsibility. The night Uncle Gary announced that divorce was the biggest failure of a woman's life. The night all of you sat there and let it happen." Mom's eyes filled with tears. "Rachel, we never meant." "You never meant to be cruel," I finished. "You never meant to be dismissive. You never meant to make me feel worthless. But you did it anyway, over and over, for my entire life." I walked to the window, looking out at the Cleveland skyline where I'd spent so many years feeling small and invisible. "Do you want to know what the real tragedy is? I would have helped you. If you'd asked if you'd ever treated me like an equal, like someone whose opinion mattered, I would have gladly used my expertise to save Monroe Industries. We could have been partners." I turned back to face them. "Instead, you made me your enemy." Dad finally spoke, his voice hollow. "We weren't trying to—" "But you did," I said simply. "And now here we are." Montgomery Brennan shuffled the papers nervously. "Perhaps we could take a brief recess. Allow everyone to process—" "No." My voice cut through his diplomatic suggestion like a blade. "We finish this now." I returned to my seat and placed my hands flat on the table. The same gesture Dad had used countless times when delivering ultimatums to his children. "You have 60 seconds to decide. Sign the documents and retain some dignity, some ownership, some future, or walk away and lose everything anyway, but with the added satisfaction of knowing you chose principle over survival." Uncle Gary looked desperately around the room, as if someone might materialize to rescue him from this nightmare. "This is blackmail, pure and simple." "This is consequences," I corrected. "Something you've spent your entire life avoiding." 30 seconds passed. Dad stared at his hands. Brian stared at the ceiling. Mom stared at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Time's up," I announced. Dad reached for the pen. "Don't you dare!" Brian hissed, but Dad was already signing his name on the first document. One by one, the required signatures appeared on the papers. Dad signed with the resignation of a man who'd accepted defeat. Brian signed with the fury of someone who'd been outplayed. Uncle Gary signed last, his hand shaking with rage, muttering curses under his breath. When the final signature was complete, I gathered the documents and placed them back in my briefcase. "Congratulations," I said, standing. "You've just made the smartest business decision of your lives." I walked toward the door, then paused and turned back. "Oh, and one more thing. Effective Monday morning, there will be some operational changes at Monroe Industries. We'll be implementing new management systems, updated financial controls, and a comprehensive review of all personnel. Brian's head snapped up. What does that mean? I smiled the same cold smile I'd perfected during a decade of family dinners where I was the punchline. It means that the woman you said couldn't handle real responsibility is now responsible for everything. Your jobs, your paychecks, your future with this company, all of it depends on proving to me that you're worth keeping around. Uncle Gary shot to his feet. You can't. I own 75% of this company, Gary, which means I can do whatever I want, just like you've been doing to me my entire life. I paused at the door, my hand on the brass handle. The difference is I actually know what I'm doing. The last thing I heard as the door closed behind me was Uncle Gary's voice, no longer booming with confidence, but cracked and desperate. This isn't over, Rachel. But it was over. The moment those signatures dried on those documents, everything changed. The family hierarchy that had kept me in my place for 36 years had just been turned completely upside down. I walked through the marble lobby and out into the Cleveland afternoon, where my Honda Civic sat waiting in the parking meter spot I'd paid for with quarters from my purse. Tomorrow, I'd probably buy something more appropriate for a majority owner of a manufacturing company. But today, I wanted to drive home in the same car I'd owned when they thought I was nothing. Because now they knew exactly what nothing could accomplish when it finally decided to become something. The day you laugh at someone's pain is the day you give them permission to make you silent. Today was that day. Thank you so much for listening to Rachel's story of revenge and redemption. I'd love to hear from you. Where are you listening to this story right now? Are you at home, commuting, or maybe taking a break at work? Drop a comment below and let's connect. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed this tale of family dynamics and ultimate justice. And please share your thoughts about Rachel's journey. What would you have done in her situation? I'd love to hear your perspective.